Demon-Kissed, Chapter 7. The wolf stopped, shook its head, and continued stalking forward, snarling viciously. "Mac, get everyone out of this alley. Now! Now, now, now!" I fairly screamed the last as the wolf's form dissolved and the vile machine underneath was revealed. Panic erupted as Mac started shouting orders to his pack, and they all got a good look at the walker. I remembered that in the vision the thing had been 8 feet tall, and that part of the vision held true, even though my actions up to this point had been slightly different from the ones in the vision, and the entire dialogue had changed. Within seconds, the alley was empty of other people save for me, Mac, and Alistair, who had rematerialized from the shadows on my left as soon as the walker showed its true form. The thing was horrible in appearance, and the smell coming from it made me gag. It appeared to be a rotting corpse surrounded by a steel or iron skeletal frame, with a solid metal plate over the chest that appeared to be holding the body upright, and long, thick struts that were riveted or bolted together in, I counted, 5 places to form joints for the arms and legs. The light from the fire reflected off of the metal, and I could see some kind of black fluid oozing from the corpse's mouth by the light as well. Whether it was blood or something else I couldn't tell from the distance I was from it and the level of light I had to see it. "Now what, Malone?" Mac demanded as I continued to back away and started looking for weaknesses in the metal exoskeleton around the corpse. Glancing out of the corners of my eyes, I saw him and Alistair doing the same. "The joints are the weakest point, I believe," Alistair said, and I nodded. "Now, Mac, we kill it," I said, and taking careful aim, I started firing at the joints. Alistair vanished into the shadows again, only to reappear in the air above the walker. I took more care with my aim, as I didn't have a lot of ammunition for the rifle in easy reach, and I didn't want to shoot Alistair by accident. Mac shifted forms and circled around behind it, and I readjusted my aim again. The bullets were lead and wouldn't kill him, or Alistair for that matter. But they would hurt them, and an injured were or vamp wouldn't be of much help to me in this fight. "I need a bigger gun," I said as the bullets shredded the metal, but didn't do enough damage to stop the walker's advance on us. I briefly thought of using my telekinesis, but I didn't have the level of control needed to stop the foul machine and leave the guys free to attack it at the same time. When I used my ability, I had a tendency to trap everything around me with it. I just hadn't been using the ability enough to fine-tune it to the point where I could freeze or levitate just one person or thing. I reloaded the rifle and realized that I hadn't put enough ammo in my pocket. This was bad. I didn't have enough ammo to keep firing for more than 5 more shots, and I couldn't call a time-out to get more out of my pack. I fired my next shot and noticed that neither Alistair or Mac seemed able to get through the metal cage to the corpse so that they could take out the head. The metal appeared to have been designed to keep supernatural beings from destroying the walkers easily, if at all. As I pulled the trigger a second time, Alistair suddenly dove into my line of sight facing me, grabbed something from my belt, and vanished again. He was so fast that when I could see again, I saw the shot I had just fired hit its mark in the left shoulder joint of the walker, tearing through it and out the other side to slam into the brick building behind it. The bullet had left a large hole, but had failed to remove the arm as I had intended when I pulled the trigger. I sighted the thing's left knee joint and pulled the trigger again. I had 2 shots left in the rifle now, and I knew that I had to make them count before I had to switch to one of the handguns. As I squeezed off another round, I heard the tiny ping of a small piece of metal hitting the pavement. Then Alistair reappeared and slammed his hand into and out of the hole I had made in its shoulder with the speed of lightning. Just as fast as he did that, he was in front of me again and wrapping one arm around my waist. He pulled me in tight to his body and launched us straight into the air. A second later, a large explosion rocked the air around us, and I felt something slam into the back of my left thigh, and I felt something else sting my lower back. Seconds after that, I heard vicious growling and tried to glance around. I was facing Alistair, and was being held so tight that it was hard to move around enough to see. But when I glanced to my right and down a bit, I saw that while Alistair had grabbed me up in one arm and was holding me firmly to his chest, he had the scruff of Mac's neck in the other hand, and the poor wolf was just sort of hanging there like a misbehaving pup. Looking past him, I saw chunks of metal and sizzling flesh littering the ground, and realized that Alistair had taken one of the 4 grenades I had on my belt. What surprised me was that I hadn't thought of using them myself. I stared at the wreckage for long moments, and as I looked down, I felt something warm and wet running down my left leg and side. Then I started to get dizzy and lightheaded. "Alistair, can you let us down now?" I asked when black dots invaded my vision, and was shocked at how whisper-thin my voice suddenly was. "We are down now, lass," Max said, and I opened my eyes. When had I closed them? His face was blurry, and I blinked, or tried to. But when my eyes closed this time, they wouldn't open again. "I smell blood, vampire, and it's coming from her." His voice sounded farther away this time, as though he were walking down a tunnel, and I fought to open my eyes again. "I can smell it too, Mutt. Now help me find the wound before she bleeds to death," Alistair snapped, and his voice, too, sounded far away. "Fine, but if she dies because you just had to use a grenade, I'm tellin'." And that was the last thing I heard before I lost consciousness for the second time this week. I came back to consciousness in a rather painfully abrupt way. I heard a loud snarl and Alistair's voice close to the pleasantly soft thing I was laying on. My eyes snapped open, and I rolled away from the noise, right off of the pleasantly soft surface I had been laying on, and fell face first onto the very hard floor. Pain radiated throughout my body, and my breath hissed through my teeth as I tried to figure out where I was. Not camp, that was certain. We didn't have wood floors or actual beds back in camp. It was a camp, after all, and a mobile one at that. "Ow!" I groaned, and lay still for a moment, staring blurrily at the nice floor. Some carpet would have been nice to land on, but the wood was a nice blonde shade and clean. "Vicious, flea-infested little brute! Release my leg!" Alistair's voice was a low hiss of sound that I barely heard when he spoke again, but hear it I did, and I pushed myself up on my arms a bit, then tried to look around, only to discover that my hair was loose and curtained my face, blocking my view of the room I was in and what was going on. "Aaron, how did you get on the floor? You should be in bed!" Isaac's exclamation came from behind me, where I now assumed the door was, and I heard his footsteps coming toward me a moment later. Leaning on one elbow, I pushed my hair away from my eyes and looked over my shoulder to see him standing behind me, a worried look on his face. Standing behind him, with Derek attached to his left ankle, was Alistair, and he was glaring down at my youngest son as though he really wanted to squash him into nothing more than a greasy smear on the nice, clean floor. Beyond them was a partially open door and a hallway, both of which, I noted, were a sickly green color that made me crave a gallon of bleach to scrub them with to get rid of the color. "Ricky, what have I told you about biting?" Gregory said quietly, coming through the doorway behind Alistair, and stopped when he saw me laying on the floor. I blinked, and in the split second I couldn't see, he moved to my side and gathered me into a crushing hug. "Greg, baby, can't breathe," I gasped into his shoulder and put my hands on his lower chest, trying to push him back a bit. After another few seconds of oxygen deprivation, he loosened his grip and leaned back a bit. Looking directly into my eyes, he growled and bared his teeth a little, then pulled me close again and buried his nose under my hair behind my right ear, and just sat there on the floor, holding me on his lap and breathing my scent. "I'm sorry, baby. I did it again, and I'm so sorry," I whispered, closing my eyes and rubbing his side gently, trying to soothe him. "You weren't alone this time, Mom, and you still almost didn't come home," he said, and his voice was a little choked with emotion. "I know, pup, I know, and My second apology was cut off by the door hitting the wall with a bang, and I jerked my head up to look over his shoulder at it. "Mama!" A choir full of young, high-pitched voices screamed, and I was suddenly buried under a pile of kids, all talking, crying, laughing, and screaming all at once. Yips, howls, roars, bays, and growling giggles filled the air, and I started laughing as I remembered the last words I heard before I passed out from what I now realized was blood loss. It wasn't long, though, before I started crying with them and couldn't seem to stop, as I gathered them all into as much of my arms as I could and held on tight. Had Alistair and Mac not been with me, I would be dead now, and my kids wouldn't have me any more. All that they'd have had left was Isaac. I couldn't keep doing this on my own every night any more. I had to get help before I ended up dead. Maybe I could request help from the Inner City Division? Grayson had told me a few months ago to never ask Inner City for help, that they could care less about the people outside the dome. But none of the people outside the dome, at least a good portion of them, would help because they would rather there not be any hunters in Outer City at all. Holding my little and not so little angels in my arms, I decided to ask the office in Inner City for help, and if they wouldn't, I'd try forceful recruiting. It had worked for Cap with Jace and Kane. It could damn well work for me, too. "Okay, kids, that's enough. We need to get your mama back in bed so that she can heal," a rich, deep, lyrical male voice said, and my heart stopped for a moment as I recognized that voice. I had fallen in love with that voice, and more than a little in love with its owner, when I was 16. Or had I been 15, I wondered, and couldn't remember. "Merrick, is that you?" I asked, and gently pushed the kids back so that I could see over them. "Yeah, it's me," he said, looking me in the eyes when I could see him. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a bit lightheaded, my thoughts a mad tumble of contradictions swirling around in my mind as I stared at him in wonder. He'd been one of my main partners on patrol, my doctor on more than one occasion, and I had thought he had been killed 3 months ago, when a gang of werebears caught him without backup in an old business building. I would never forget the radio contact with him that night. One moment he was teasing me over the line, the next he was calling for help with the bears, and Jerry and I were too far away to get there in time. Clint and Frank had been closer, but they didn't get there in time either. In fact, both had said that the werebears had shredded Merrick. They had told me later that they had buried what was left of him in one of the cemeteries. Yet, standing in the doorway was a man who looked just like him, sounded just like him, and stood just like him. Merrick wasn't dead. He didn't look dead. He looked very much alive. But how? Why was he back now? Was he other, like Jace? If so, that would explain much about him, but even Jace could have been killed if a bunch of bears ripped him apart like that. So, he was not human. But what? He wasn't a vampire or a were. He didn't feel like a demon or an elf. And I was certain he wasn't a djinn. So, Fae maybe, or... My mind spun with the possibilities, and I began to feel lightheaded. "Eerie, love, you need to breathe more slowly or you'll pass out," he said. "I thought you were dead." I let my voice trail off and tried to stand, only to realize that my left leg was bound in bandages from my knee to thigh, as was my lower left side from my hip to my lower ribs, and I couldn't move very well on my own. Did they have to use all these bandages? I looked at them for a moment and noted that I was only wearing a pair of boy shorts, panties, and a tight white see-through t-shirt. Why am I wearing next to nothing? I stared for a moment, then looked at the rest of my body, blinked at the heavy bruising on my arms and legs, then looked up at Isaac. Was all this really necessary? Did someone beat me with a bat while I was out? Why am I nearly naked, and have I finally lost my mind? Because I could have sworn that he was dead. I asked him to cover all of my questions and covered my chest with my arms. Yes, it was. You're nearly naked because they couldn't treat your wounds with your clothes on you, and your mind's been gone since the night I saved your butt. That's the whole reason why we're still friends," he answered, scooping me up into his arms and putting me back on the bed. I just stared at him for a second as I realized he hadn't answered all of my questions. "Your words comfort me greatly," I said sarcastically, grabbing for the sheet and pulling it up. "Good, now stay," he said, and stepped back from the bed once I was covered. "Bite me. I'm not a dog, and I am the one who's injured here," I said. Then, guessing what he'd say next, I added, "And I broke my promise. I know. I'm sorry." "What are you talking about? You kept your word. You came back in one piece and breathing. That was what you promised me. And Alistair and Mac brought you home," he said, and shrugged. I stared incredulously at him, and a tiny, enigmatic smile shaped his lips in response. "We need to talk, you and I said, and looked around him to the children. "What are you waiting for? Get up here and let me hold you some more," I said, and smiled. Gregory helped the littlest ones onto the bed, and the bigger kids climbed up on their own. Once everyone was on the bed, they all cuddled up to me or held on to me however they could. Barnaby and Bailey snuggled up to me on my right side. Derek and Mindy carefully crawled into my lap. Casey, Joan, Marley, and Harley all curled up at the foot of the bed and touched my lower legs. Lucky, Todd, Raven, and Shay crawled to the head and wrapped their fingers in my hair. Gregory and Michelangelo sat to either side of me and held my hands tightly. Each of these kids meant the world to me, and I in turn was their world. Isaac was with me every time I found one of them, and he usually stayed in camp with them when I was on patrol or out on a call. Of the two of us, he made the better parent, but all the kids called him Uncle and called me Mom. Isaac was with them all the time, and I was gone every day and night. I had often questioned this when I first started bringing them back to base with me when I was 17. But now I just didn't think about it, and Isaac didn't seem to mind it in the least. Turning my head to the right, I looked at Merrick standing in the doorway and noted that he looked tired and a little thin. His amber-colored eyes had dark circles under them, and his usual golden tan was a bit faded. The black button-down shirt he wore hung on his 6-foot 7-inch runner's frame like a sack, and his lean, handsome face was lined with fatigue. "Just what have you been doing, Reich, since last I saw you, that has made you look so worn?" I wondered, and saw him start as though he had heard my thoughts. Or maybe he read them on my face. It was a possibility, a faint one. Another possibility was that he was telepathic like me, and he'd read my mind.